Hi, welcome. I'm Sarah Dixon. I am the Adult Programming Manager here at the Advanced Learning Library. And this is my colleague, Ian. Ian, wave your hand. And Ian and I are working to put together a civics series all year long. So it is an election year. There's lots of great topics out there. We're starting with Democracy 101 with our dear friend, Dr. Alexandra Middlewood, who is a department chair over at WSU of her political science department. Yes, that's right. And so I'm going to let her give her own bio, her own introduction, but just a couple of housekeeping things. If we could turn our phones on silent. And then also we have evaluations in the back. So if you could be sure to share with us, we're starting to think about what we want to do for summer. So if you have any civically minded, community minded events that you would like to see here, let us know. Maybe we can put that towards the second half of our year. But next month, we have how to serve on a nonprofit board. Like if that's been something that has intimidated you in the past, we'll come learn all about it. We're going to demystify it. And then coming up in our second quarter, we're going to do voter ID laws. We're going to do a program on running elections in Sedgwick County. So we're going to hear directly from our election county office. And then what's our third one? Oh, it's just going to be Community Engagement Academy. So through the city puts on a Civic Engagement Academy. They have an 8-week course. We're going to put it in 90 minutes. So come and learn all about that. Stay tuned. We're going to do all kinds of great stuff. Anything else that we want to say? Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Alex now, and let's learn.
Thank you all for having me and for being here. I know with the weather, today may not have been ideal, but I appreciate you all coming out. Move this slightly. Okay. So as Sarah mentioned, I am the Department Chair of Political Science at Wichita State University. This is my 5th year at WSU. I got my PhD at KU, so I am quickly becoming a Kansan. Thank you. And I teach mostly classes on civic engagement, American politics, public opinion, and gender and politics. So I'm going to incorporate a little bit of all of those things into this talk today, including some public opinion data from Kansans right here in our state. So we will end with some of that public opinion data today. My research mostly focuses on gun politics, actually, and political behavior of American gun owners. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but if you're interested in that, you can look up some of the things I've written online about that. But civic engagement and political behavior is something that I am extremely passionate about. It's my #1 goal in every class that I teach to my students is that they know that they should participate and why they participate. I don't care who they vote for. I care that they vote and they know why they vote for those people. And so I tried to take a lot of information from several different of my classes and condense them into a 90-minute talk. There will be time at the end for questions. As I'm going through, if you have questions or something doesn't make sense, please feel free to stop and ask. But any other questions, we'll have time at the end. So, so we don't waste any more time. The talk today is Democracy 101, making sense of government and politics. So government and politics can be a really scary topic for a lot of people. It's a complicated thing to learn about, and I hope to demystify that for you all a little bit here today. So I wanted to start with the basics. So everyone takes an American government class in high school, at least if you graduate from a school in the United States. Not everyone takes a collegiate class or goes to college. So I really wanted to start with the basics of what is government. So governments really vary in their structure, size, and how they operate. But we can really narrow it down to 2 key questions that when we answer these, gives us how different or how governments differ. We look at first who governs, so who is governing in this system and how much government control is permitted. So we're going to start with the basics here and then we're going to talk about the United States specifically. So when we ask the question of who governs, we really have three options. So in some governments, it's an autocracy, which means there is a single person who governs. Usually that is a monarch or a dictator. Sometimes we call them presidents, but they're really dictators. So this is ruled by a single person. We also have oligarchy, which is ruled by a small group. Sometimes this is military leaders. Once upon a time, it was landowners. Sometimes it's the wealthy, but it really means a small group controls all governing decisions. And then third, we have a democracy, which is what we're all familiar with because we live in one. We actually live in several different levels of democracy, which we'll talk about halfway through this talk today. In a democracy, we should all be familiar with this, citizens play a significant role in government decision-making, usually through the election of public officials. And so we go and we elect people on election day by casting our ballots. They go represent our interests, at least theoretically, in government at the various different levels. We also have some forms of direct democracy. We're not going to touch on those too much today, but there are some places and some availability for citizens to vote directly on policy. If you voted in the August 2022 primary in Kansas, you got to vote directly on a constitutional amendment. And that is a form of direct democracy. There are some states that have other forms of direct democracy, so they can actually put constitutional amendments on the ballot. You can recall elected officials. And so those are all types of different direct democracy, but we have them in the United States in a very limited capacity, only at the state and local level. And even then, the availability of them really differs significantly based on the government we're talking about. So our second question is how much government control is permitted? And so we have constitutional governments, which is what we all have here in the United States. In a constitutional government, there is, I think this is on. Okay. I was like, why am I echoing? Okay, so we have constitutional governments here in the United States, and this is where government is structured by a formal document. So a constitution, there are formal and effective limits that are placed on the powers of government. So in the Constitution, there are outlines for what government looks like, so who governs, what the various different types of branches of that government are going to be, but also what government can do and what government cannot do. So in the United States, we have our Constitution, which outlines the different branches or institutions of government, how those interact with each other, and then we have the Bill of Rights, which tells government what they cannot do, for the most part. Some of those amendments, and we'll talk about a couple of those today, talk about what rights citizens have, but for the most part, they're saying, government, you cannot do these things. You cannot quarter soldiers in people's houses, for example. We tend to forget about the Third Amendment. Maybe one day it will have its day in the sun, but the day is not today. And within constitutional governments, we also have pluralism. So there are multiple different groups in society that are competing for the ability to have some government power. So pluralism is a really important component to democracy and to constitutional governments, because it means that there are multiple people that have a chance of winning an election and having their interests represented in government. The next option is authoritarian governments. These are actually growing in number across the world. In authoritarian governments, sometimes there are constitutions. So that is one key thing that I wanted to mention here. Just because a country has a constitution does not mean it's a democracy. Authoritarian governments often have constitutions, and they use those constitutions to maintain control of government for a small group of people or for an individual. And so in an authoritarian government, there's no formal limit on governing power. So essentially, the people in power can do whatever they want. But they are sometimes restrained by other social institutions. So think of things like churches, labor unions, nonprofit organizations. In most of the world, we call those non-governmental organizations. They're essentially the same thing. those are all competing for government power or competing for some sort of social power in authoritarian governments. The third is a totalitarian government. So this is where government has total control, not just of government, but of all of the public sphere. So there are no social institutions to challenge that power. So there are no churches or labor unions, etc., that exist outside of the government's sphere of influence. So when we think about totalitarian governments, think of something like Nazi Germany, for example, where every single institution, social or political, was controlled by the party in that government. So those are our three types of government. We are going to focus mostly on representative democracy because that's what we have today in the United States. And we're going to talk a little bit about how what representative has changed throughout US history as well. So representative democracy is a system of government in which the populace selects representatives who play a significant role in governmental decision making. And so not only are we electing those representatives, but those representatives make government decisions and are responsive to the people. Sometimes we call these just a democracy, or just a republic, or a democratic republic. These are all essentially the same thing. These are just 4 different words that we can use to all talk about representative democracy. One of my biggest pet peeves, and hopefully it will be one of yours now too, is when people like to say that the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. Well, guess what? We are both. And that is because we are a representative democracy, or a democratic republic, or a democracy, or a republic. We can use them all interchangeably. So what is a constitution and why do we have one? So we have a constitutional representative democracy in the United States, and our Constitution outlines the principles, rules, and processes that form the basis for our government. The Constitution also acts as a type of social contract. And so we as citizens agree to give up some power to the government to make decisions, and we consent to be governed as long as the government protects some of our rights. So we still have freedoms, we still have liberty, we still have things like equality and individualism, but we're giving up the ability to do literally anything we want in order for some of the protections and the stability that come with having a government. And so it's a social contract. We give up something so that we are protected in other ways, essentially. In our Constitution, in the United States, is focused on this idea that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So this quote comes from James Madison. He's often known as the father of the Constitution. And we had a different constitution first in the United States. It was called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch at the federal level. There was no judicial branch at the federal level. There was a single legislative branch where each state only had one vote, and it did not work. There were all sorts of reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed that we just don't have time to get into today. So we've created this new constitution. James Madison put really in every single layer of the document that we needed to have competing interests in government in order to keep government accountable and to keep its powers in check. And so if we wanted to keep the executive branch from becoming too ambitious, we needed to give some powers to the legislative branch to counteract that ambition. And so essentially what our Constitution creates is a system of government where every single branch of the federal government is competing with each other for governing power. And that was done intentionally. And it was done to keep a single branch from becoming too powerful. It also is apparent in federalism, which we have in the United States, where we not only have the federal level of government, but we have state governments and local governments as well. And so to keep those different levels of branches from becoming too powerful, there are some powers that are given to the national government, some to the states, and then some states give specific powers to their localities. And that is still rooted in this idea that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And so if you're ever looking at the structure of government in the United States and you're like, this makes no sense, why did we structure it this way? One of the big reasons is because the framers were really afraid of one branch or one level of government from becoming too powerful. So they spread the power around and they made them compete with each other for governing authority. So the result is the US political system that we have today. This is a very simplified version of that, but it's essentially a feedback loop. And so we have the process there in the middle. I'm going to start in the middle and then work my way out. The process there in the middle is those branches of government. So it's the executive, the legislative, the judicial branch. It's the federal bureaucracy that implements all of those laws. That is all part of that middle process section. The output from government is different policies. So we get different policies, we get decisions, right? Sometimes policies come in legislation as laws. Sometimes it comes as court decisions from the Supreme Court or various federal district courts. Sometimes it comes as executive orders. Those are all a type of this output. Then citizens evaluate that output. Do we like the policies that are being passed in government? Do we like that law or that judicial decision or that executive order? And we give feedback on that through input. So by voting is one option, by writing letters to our public officials, by contacting them in any way, by protesting, perhaps. And so those are all different ways that we put input into government. Media is also an important input into government that we're really not going to talk too much about today, but I did want to mention that it is another input there. So how did we get all of these different institutions of government in our Constitution? Well, it was a series of compromises. So there are a lot of people who look at the Constitution as this, pillar of democracy in the United States. They think that it's this perfect document that shouldn't change, etc. But a lot of the decisions that were actually made at the Constitutional Convention were made because it was the only way they could get the Constitution passed. So for example, we have Congress as a bicameral legislature, which means two chambers of Congress, because large states like Virginia and small states like New Jersey could not agree on what type of legislature they wanted. And so they came together and they formed the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Plan, where we now have a bicameral Congress with each state being represented according to its population in the House of Representatives and equal representation of 2 senators per state in the Senate. We have this type of legislature because it was the only type they could get everyone at the convention to agree to. The same goes for the Electoral College. So the Electoral College chooses the president in the United States. Each state is supposed to cast their votes in the way that the popular vote of their state went. So there are a couple of exceptions to that. There are 2 states that choose their Electoral College votes a different way. They actually divide them based on the population and how each congressional district voted. That is Maine and Nebraska. But other than those 2 states, every other state says, okay, a candidate B won Kansas, candidate B gets all 6 Electoral College votes in Kansas. Well, this was another compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And it was because there was competition between large states and small states, again, competition between the North and the South. So there was a lot of concern that northern presidential candidates would get a lot of vote from northern states, which tended to be bigger in population than southern states. There was also this concern of having an executive that was too powerful, that could become tyrannical. And so the Electoral College is another result of this compromise that we see at the Constitutional Convention that now governs how we have and choose our president today. Next, we have the judicial branch. This is perhaps one of the branches that did not quite come out of the same level of compromise as those other two, but its function was definitely a compromise. So specifically, it was made to resolve conflict between states, to act as a safeguard against democratic impulses, to guard against the potential abuse of liberty by the federal government. So in short, the purpose of the judicial branch was to protect citizens from the government and to protect government from the citizens. Because there was a lot of disagreement about who would become tyrannical. Is it tyranny of the majority? Would citizens be tyrannical? Or would a government that is full of elites separate from the population become tyrannical? And so the judicial branch was formed as a way to balance that. So there's more balance put, or not balance, excuse me, more impact put towards personal freedoms than government power in this case. You will notice here that determining the constitutionality of laws is not listed here as a key function of the judicial branch in the Constitution, and that's because it's not. The Supreme Court actually gave itself that power in one of their first Supreme Court cases that they heard after the new Constitution was passed. So nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the judicial branch gets to decide the constitutionality of laws. But you could take an entire class just on that topic. So we're not going to go into too much more detail on that, unfortunately. We also get separation of powers. So this is that idea of ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So we have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. They're all given their own powers. So the executive, or the president, as we call them, can veto, is the commander-in-chief of the military, is in charge of foreign affairs, can make executive orders, and can appoint various cabinet positions and also members of the judiciary. The legislature gets to pass laws, they get to ratify the treaties, so that's specifically the Senate, and they also pass the budget. And then the judicial branch determines the constitutionality of laws. And so the fact that each one of these branches has separate powers is this idea of separation of powers. But each one of those powers serves to check and balance the other powers of those other branches. And so, yes, the legislature can pass laws, but the executive can veto them. And the judicial branch can determine if those laws are constitutional. So they get to use judicial review to determine whether that is constitutional or not. The executive gets to be commander-in-chief of the military, but they're reliant on the legislature to pass the military budget. These are all examples of these checks and balances. And so each branch has its own power, but they're made to check and balance each other because ambition must be made to counteract ambition. We can't let one branch get more powerful than another. And then we have federalism, where we have all of those branches of government at the federal level, as we call it, or the national level. We have some powers that are specifically given to states, and then some powers that are shared between the two branches. So only the federal government, for example, can pass treaties or declare war, those types of things. Only states get to do things like really oversee education. I was going to say taxes, but that's the shared powers one. Education is one of them. They are in charge of infrastructure, holding elections. Election administration is a state power. Those are all powers of the states. And then shared powers are powers that they have together, so they can share, like taxation. In the Constitution, it actually specifically says that any powers not given or implied to belong to the federal government are therefore held for the states. And so anything in the Constitution that's not specifically said to be a federal power or to be implied to be a federal power is then reserved for the states. So again, we see these different levels of government competing against each other for governing power. So those are all different examples of how the US Constitution is this series of compromises. And it's really astonishing that for such an important document that has existed for so long, it's very broad, open-ended, not detailed or specific. So if you have ever read the Constitution or gone to the National Archives and seen copies of it, it's not that in-depth and it's not that long either. There's lots of ambiguous language, and this really comes as a result of those series of compromises that led to it being ratified in the first place. This has allowed for there to be multiple interpretations and an evolving and flexible document that has changed and been interpreted and reinterpreted based on the social and political climate of the time and the changing political environment. And by doing this, the framers were really entrusting future generations with the ability and the responsibility to then draw upon intelligence, judgment, and experience to give concrete meaning to these broad principles. And this is summed up really well in this quote from Chief Justice John Marshall, who's a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, where he said, "We must never forget it is the Constitution we are expounding, intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs." It's not possible to have a constitution that is so specific and detailed that it can then last for 250 years as the US Constitution has. The only reason it's been able to last so long is because it's broad, it's ambiguous, it's open-ended and not detailed or specific, but that has allowed for it to be this changing and flexible document to change to the political environment of the time. So the whole purpose of the Constitution, or one of its founding dilemmas, is to find this fundamental balance, to have a government that is strong enough to preserve order, yet not so strong that it would threaten personal liberties. And so the entire Constitution is written in a way to really balance government power and personal freedoms. And this is a struggle and it's a challenge, especially when everyone has different ideas of how much government power is permissible, and especially how much government power should be permissible if it's infringing on personal freedoms. We had different answers to that question 250 years ago, and we certainly have different answers to that question today. And so the Constitution, being so ambiguous and vague, allows for this shift and this balance over time. We typically see that government power is framed in the Constitution and personal freedoms are framed in the Bill of Rights. In the Constitution itself, there are really no personal freedoms that are outlined. It doesn't even say, for example, that we have the right to vote in the United States. It's implied that we do because it says that we should hold elections, but there's no guaranteed right to vote in the Constitution. There's not even a guaranteed right to vote in the Bill of Rights. It's not until the 15th Amendment in the middle of the 1800s, right after the Civil War, that we see a right to vote being enshrined in the Constitution. But we do see other types of personal freedoms that are written right into the Bill of Rights. So the one we typically think of is the First Amendment, which establishes the foundation for freedoms of expression. So the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. And so this is really divided into two parts. So the first part is freedom of religion. So we have the Establishment Clause, which says government cannot establish a religion, and the Free Exercise Clause, which says that the government can't stop individuals from the free exercise of their religion. Sometimes those are contradictory. In fact, they're contradictory a lot. There's been a lot of Supreme Court cases that have dealt with that issue. And then the second half of the First Amendment says that we have these personal freedoms of freedom of speech, of the press, to petition, to assemble, or to protest. The one thing you'll notice here, and that one thing that a lot of people forget, is that this specifically says that Congress shall make no law. This doesn't protect you from private entities. It does not protect you from businesses. It doesn't even protect you from judgment of your peers. It just says that government cannot stop you from doing these things. It's specific to government. That's become even more important in the last couple of years. So as I mentioned, there's no voting right in the Constitution, that we have those other personal freedoms. There's no voting right in the Articles or the Bill of Rights. There was and have been some attempts to add a right to vote into the Constitution, but all attempts at a constitutional amendment to do so have failed in Congress. Part of the reason why it was never added to the Constitution to begin with was because states had already started to incorporate laws that either enfranchised or disenfranchised different citizens within their states. So as I mentioned, prior to the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which is a different type of constitution. Under that, states were severely limiting who could vote in elections. Typically, you had to be male, white, property owning, and in some states, you had to be a Christian as well. And so because all of these different enfranchise requirements had already been adopted by states, and the framers of the Constitution were really trying to get this passed, they didn't want to put a right to vote in the Constitution that would then upset the states that had to then ratify the Constitution to put it into power. They were really afraid of antagonizing those states by mandating certain requirements. So they didn't. They just left it vague and ambiguous and let the states decide, ultimately leading to the outbreak of the Civil War. We do have this core political value in the United States of equality, specifically political equality. So I'm not talking about economic equality here. It's really this idea of one person, one vote. And it's this core democratic principle. And this was true in part of those values that were written into the Constitution, even if they weren't expressly stated in there. And so we have to remember that even though there's no explicit right to vote in the Constitution, this is still this core value in American politics. So there was no way that states were going to pass this Constitution and then say no one gets to vote. That wasn't going to happen. But they were going to severely restrict who could vote, and they did so. In the 1960s, so even up until at least my parents' generation, they were born in the 1960s, this idea almost caused the United States to abandon the Electoral College. So there were some, and there's still lots of discussion today about how the Electoral College undermines this principle of one person, one vote, and undermines democracy in general. So in the 1960s, Congress tried to pass a constitutional amendment that would change this, would abolish the Electoral College and go to a popular vote. It passed the House with 82% support, and then was killed by a filibuster led by Southern senators in the Senate. If you're not familiar with what a filibuster is, it used to be where you stand and you talk a bill to death. And so the longest filibuster on record, for example, is 24 hours. That's of the Civil Rights Act, also in the 1960s. And so basically, you will see senators stand on the floor of the Senate and they will just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and try to kill a bill by talking it to death. What a more recent example, though I say recent, this was 10 years ago now, is Ted Cruz reading Green Eggs and Ham on the floor of the Senate as in a filibuster. So you may have seen that video. It goes viral every couple of years. We no longer do filibusters in the same way in the United States. So they changed the rules around filibusters about 5 years ago now. Well, I guess it's 2024, so a little bit longer than that. The years are going by quickly. And so now basically just the threat of a filibuster is enough to stop a bill in its tracks. So you don't see senators actually standing on the floor and talking these bills to death anymore. That was a major aside here. So this principle of one person, one vote still exists in the Constitution, even if it's not explicitly written in there. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why we have elections. So if there's no right to vote in the Constitution, why bother? Government could just say, we're not going to hold elections and we're just going to do whatever we want, right? Theoretically, though they would never actually do that. First of all, the political environment of the time was coming out of a revolution, this brand new country, one of the first modern democracies that had been established. They weren't going to try to cross that line. But there are also very practical and realistic reasons why governments want to hold elections. And some of these you'll see are true even in non-democratic countries. So authoritarian countries often hold elections. And so some of these reasons that I'm going to talk through here are even reasons why those authoritarian governments hold elections. Though, of course, not this one, because those elected officials are not accountable. This is specific to democracies. So we have elections because it gives accountability in elected officials. So we often refer to this as the delegate model of representation, where people are elected to go to Congress or to go to the state legislature and act as delegates for their citizens. So they should know exactly what the people in their district want to see done, what policies they would like to pass, their stances on different issues, and they should vote in a way that's going to be popular and supported by at least a majority of the citizens in their district. So this is maybe an idealistic model of representation, but it is certainly one that still does exist because elected officials do have to get reelected to continue to go back to the state legislature or to Congress. So they do spend a lot of time figuring out what their constituents want and trying to vote in a way that at least on a majority of things, they can point to those issues and say, I passed these different bills, and these are things that people in our district like. This really comes from this threat of electoral defeat. If they don't do that, citizens in their district just aren't going to vote for them again. And so they're not going to risk not being reelected by totally ignoring what their constituents want. It also allows for enhanced representation. So some people feel more represented if there are people elected that have similar political values, political parties, right? We use those as our default method of electing people most of the time, but also things like descriptive representation. So people who have a similar background to you or are the same gender or sexuality or race, right? So people feel this enhanced level of representation because of those things as well. We also have elections to increase government power and authority. So this is one of those examples where you wouldn't typically think that elections could increase government power and authority, but they do. So we know through public opinion data that after voters cast a ballot in an election, they have higher levels of trust in government and they have higher levels of political efficacy. Political efficacy is this idea that what I do, or what people, or what my beliefs are can affect government, that they actually care about what I want. So we see in public opinion surveys that trust goes up and efficacy goes up after someone participates in an election, especially compared to someone who doesn't vote. We don't see that same increase in trust and efficacy. And so if we have more trust in government, that also increases government power to be able to do things like pass legislation, maybe legislation that we really like or maybe we don't like. Okay, so elections also reinforce the status quo. And so the status quo is that we have a government that we care about during election time, but a lot of the time we kind of leave it alone. Maybe we don't pay as much attention to it as we should. And we let our representatives act more as trustees rather than delegates, where they can use their own personal opinions on matters to decide who they're going to vote, or how they're going to vote on different pieces of legislation. And so elections also enforce that status quo as well. Elections also perpetuate the power of government. And so government only has power because we give it to them. So every time we participate in an election, we are saying, yes, we believe this is legitimate. And yes, these people have the ability to make governing decisions for us. And so it's perpetuating the power of government as well. Elections also socialize political activity. So we know for a fact that once someone votes in an election one time, they're much more likely to vote continuously in future elections as well. And so if someone votes, they're also more likely to participate in other ways. So if you care enough to go and cast a ballot, maybe you also care enough to tell your elected official when they're doing something that you don't like, or to volunteer to work on their campaign, or to engage in a protest if they're really doing something you don't like. And so if people care enough to vote, they also tend to care enough to engage in these other types of behaviors as well. Elections also educate citizens on the proper ways to participate. And so a proper way, I have this in quotes for a reason, right, is if you are disgruntled about government or the people who are elected, you go to the ballot box and you just don't vote for them in the next election. That's the proper way that a lot of people will say you should participate. That being said, things like protests and different types of sit-down strikes and things like that definitely do serve a purpose, especially when participating in an election is not enough to get your point across. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the talk today. Elections also limit the scope and intensity of political behavior. So going back to that example I just said, right, if you are disgruntled about government, you don't like what they're doing, rather than initially going out to the streets and protesting, voting is a way to give people an outlet for that intensity. It's a non-threatening form of political participation. It creates that expectation of the proper way for citizens to be involved, again, proper here in quotes, and it gives people that outlet for their frustrations, for their participation where maybe they want to participate in other ways, but there's an election coming up, so instead they're just going to go cast their ballots. This works in some cases, and it does really limit the scope and intensity of political behavior until we see citizens getting to a point where they're no longer being represented by who they're voting for, or maybe they're being totally blocked from the ballot box in different types of voter suppression as well. And so typically we see people turn to voting as this initial way to participate and to have an outlet for their frustration, but then we'll turn to other ways if continued voting doesn't actually change anything. And last, we have elections because it creates certainty and stability in a democracy. So democracy is a messy form of government. We actually have this saying in political science where autocracies, especially ones that are long established, are some of the most stable types of government. And that's because they don't change all that much. There's no new elections to elect new people. And so it's fairly consistent. Does that mean it's a good type of government? Absolutely not. But it's stable and it's certain, which democracies are not. So every 4 years, we can elect a new president in the United States. That can create a lot of uncertainty and a lot of instability. Elections inherently create winners and losers. And we have established norms in the United States where losers will concede elections, but we know that that doesn't always happen. And that can create a lot of uncertainty and a lot of instability, and that can create a lot of anxiety and fear amongst citizens and government officials as well. And so we have elections as a way to try to navigate that, where we have norms, where if you lose an election, you will then relinquish, right? You will try not to stay in power or gain power if you were not elected. And so elections kind of help that process to go forward and create more certainty and stability in a democracy. But I also wanted to note that US elections have not always been representative. And so I mentioned earlier that initially, under the Constitution, the people who could vote were male, white, landowners. Sometimes they had to be Christian. And so that all came about because the US Constitution does not include voting rights. And so states immediately put these disenfranchisement laws into place to try to limit who could participate. And so we talk about the United States being a democracy since 1776, or if you want to go with the US Constitution being ratified, that is 1789. But we're talking about a very small group of people that can actually participate in elections. And so US elections in 1789 were not representative of all the people who lived in the United States at the time. In 1870, we see enfranchisement expanded with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote. This is one of those Reconstruction amendments that came after the Civil War, though it was still severely restricted in many states. So a lot of states, especially southern states, enacted what we tend to call Jim Crow laws, and those restricted who could vote in elections, even though the 15th Amendment says that Black men do have the right to vote. Some states put in laws like if your grandfather didn't have the right to vote, you then don't have the right to vote. So we call those grandfather laws. Or if you've used the term grandfathered in, that's where that comes from, is from this 15th Amendment or post 15th Amendment Jim Crow laws. There were also things like literacy tests where people had to be able to read a passage to be able to vote. A lot of the times the passage that was given to them was in Latin and was not in English, so they could not read it. And there are various different ways that these rights were restricted. Here, I talk about Jim Crow laws in the South. There are also some in northern states like New York that specifically tried to disenfranchise Jewish voters by putting early registration days or the only registration days on the Sabbath, things like that. So this happened in a lot of different states across the country and not just the Deep South. And then in 1920, we get the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote, though I really should have put in parentheses white women the right to vote because we still saw a lot of those Jim Crow laws in place. In 1964, right, so we're getting fairly recent in US history, the 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, so you could no longer charge people to vote at the polls by giving them a tax that they had to pay to do so. That wasn't until 1964. That was the year my father was born, so that doesn't feel very long ago. 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. This abolishes those Jim Crow laws that suppress voting rights. In the 1970s, so a couple years later, we get additional voting for protections specifically for language minority citizens. So citizens who do not speak English now have to get ballots in their native language. There are all different types of regulations that counties have on, do they have to offer ballots in Spanish, et cetera. And I believe there's a threshold in most counties. But the federal government says that they now have voting right protections in the 1970s. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. This is really in response to the Vietnam War. So we were sending people overseas to fight in Vietnam who were not eligible to vote because you had to be 21 to vote before this time. So they lowered the voting age to 18 in the 26th Amendment. And then in 1993, and also again in 2002, we get equal ballot access for persons with disabilities. So you have to, all polling locations now have to have handicap accessible polling locations. They have to have machines that will read the ballot out loud to them for people who can't read on their own, and all sorts of different access measures there. So we really see this long period of enfranchisement in the United States that doesn't really start with 1789 when the Constitution is ratified. There are some people, political scientists included, who will argue that the United States was not truly a democracy until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was established. And that's because very few people could actually participate in elections before that. And we still see some forms of voter suppression, or at least types of different disenfranchisement. Even if they're not laws, they're norms, or are pursued in different ways, even if they're technically illegal, through the mobilization process. So mobilization is a process where parties, activist groups, etc., will try to encourage people to participate in politics, usually through voting, but sometimes other ways. But the goal of mobilization is not to involve every citizen. So you will see some groups that do want every citizen to vote. So if they're a nonprofit organization, for example, that focuses specifically on increasing voter turnout, they want everyone to vote. But political parties, different groups, right, or even other nonprofit organizations that focus on one particular issue, they want their supporters to get out and vote. But they really don't want everyone to, because they don't want people who oppose them to be mobilized either. And so oftentimes these organizations that are in charge of voter mobilization are focusing on people they already know, people with large social networks, and people that have resources. So essentially people who are better able to pay the cost of participating. So they can, go and vote. They don't have to work all day. Or they can pay to get a new voter ID if they've moved. Those types of things. So they're focusing on people that they already know that are going to have easy access to the polls. People who can drive, for example. And in fact, some groups are actively encouraged to stay home and to not participate by various organizations. And so mobilization really is, and by focusing mobilization through different parties, groups, candidates, etc., it really allows for still limited representation of who is actually voting in elections. We very rarely get over 50% of all registered voters voting in statewide elections. Last year in Wichita, I think we hit 21%. I should have looked that up, but I forgot. Of all registered voters voting in Wichita, which is really sad because that's really, really low. And that's partially because of this mobilization process. So we allow candidates, parties, groups to focus their energy and activities and their resources, their money. It's expensive to mobilize voters, to focus specifically on people that they know are going to turn out. And that really focuses on a very specific type of citizen and really leaves other people to the wayside. So they're also not being represented in government.
I have a question. Yeah. What is the difference between mobilization and lobbying?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the difference between mobilization and lobbying? Lobbying is to engage in activism of people who are in elected office. Mobilization is of citizens. And so you can see lobbying groups mobilizing citizens. They definitely do that. So some organizations will mobilize citizens and also lobby elected officials, but they're two different activities. Mobilization focuses on citizens. That's a great question. Oops. And so we often look to voting as this only reliable path to good, accountable government. It maintains the status quo. We often beg people to please vote, but we often ignore some of these things that I just talked about, where representation has only recently expanded to most groups in the United States. One thing I didn't put on that list that I should have was there are still a lot of states where people who've been convicted of felonies cannot vote. So that's another group of people that are not represented. But people are often voting is often portrayed as this way to have good, accountable government. But we ignore that there are tons of people who don't participate for various different reasons. Some of those reasons are individual. Some of those reasons are systemic or institutional, like some of those examples we just talked about. And so if we look to elections as mechanisms to limit the scope and intensity of political behavior, we also have to recognize that that is not always enough. there are a lot of issues that voting does not solve, especially when we see certain types of people running for office over and over again. There are some academic studies that show when you have less professionalized legislatures, they get paid low amounts of money, maybe like right here in Kansas, that the type of people who run for office are wealthier, self-sufficient, people who are able to take, half a year off from their jobs, etc. And so there are lots of people who don't feel represented by those candidates. We're seeing this increasingly among young people in the United States. And that's because there are societal problems that these young people care about that elections consistently do not fix. We tend to call these post-materialist issues or social issues, things like racism, sexism, homophobia, the wealth gap, etc. And so people often turn to protest as a way to get their voices heard when they don't feel like elections are, and the people that they can vote for are truly representing them in government. And so that's one reason why we get things like this, where I'm going to generously say 30%, 30% of the people portrayed here voted, right? Those over there with the I voted on their t-shirts. And the 70% say we didn't vote because it doesn't make a difference. Sometimes it's because they don't feel represented. Sometimes it's because they were actively asked, even if it was not directly asked, to stay home and to not participate. Sometimes it's also because they don't have confidence in elections. And so election integrity is a really big component of democracy. It's also something we've been talking about a lot in American politics in the last several years. So election integrity is vital. It's an essential component of democracy. And it has been a major concern since the turn of the century. And so we've talked about it a lot, really since 2016, but this has always been a major concern in government and in politics. At the turn of the century, we see the progressive era, where we see these widespread political reforms that swept across the country. And these really reestablished that idea of one person, one vote, also reestablished the idea of the secret ballot. So we had what you would call political machines, and I'll show you an example of a cartoon from this here in a minute. We had political machines where if you wanted to keep your job, you had to vote in a certain way. And that was because there was no secret ballot. We also saw the introduction of direct democracy in some state and local elections. So I talked about this earlier, an example being constitutional amendments that we get to vote on here in Kansas. The one difference in Kansas being that they have to come through the state legislature. We cannot directly put constitutional amendments on the ballot as citizens through initiative petitions. We don't have that ability here. But there are, I believe, 30 states that you can do that. So that's where we get these different mechanisms of direct democracy as well. So this photo, image, drawing, it's not a photo, a drawing, is from 1815 in Pennsylvania, and it's called Election Day at the State House. You can see there's lots of partying, lots of rioting, right? This guy's fallen down over here. This was an election day in Pennsylvania. This is what this is portraying. And so in the early 1800s, right, shortly after the Constitution was ratified, elections were really reasons for people to engage in drunkenness, to have parades, to have riots in the streets. There was lots of concerns during this time about election integrity. And so there were people who were, beating up other people in the streets to try to get them not to vote, etc. And so a lot of these progressive era reforms come from very valid concerns. This being one example. This political cartoon is actually from right here in Kansas. This is from when Kansas was voting on a constitution to become a state. And what you see here is people going to the polls, voting on the state constitution, which included the abolition of slavery, Kansas entering the Union as a free state, as Northeast Kansas likes to remind us, casting their ballot, going back around the loop to the pubs, to the bars, getting drunk, and then getting back in line to go vote again in that same election. So again, very valid concerns about election integrity. Here's another one from this area. This is Missouri, but it's Kansas City specifically. Has anyone heard of Tom Pendergast in Kansas City? No? So he ran the Pendergast political machine. The saying in Kansas City goes that Kansas City is built on Pendergast concrete. He was basically a concrete baron, and he used his political machine and corruption to get a bunch of city contracts where they used his concrete to build streets, structures, etc. And then he used that to buy off members of the city council to do what he wanted. He then expanded that to Jackson County, which is the county that Kansas City is in, and got one man in particular elected to the county commission. That man would be Harry S. Truman, and then bankrolled him into the United States presidency using his corrupt political machine money. And so all of these pushes for, direct democracy, these concerns about election integrity are really founded in very valid concerns about election integrity in the United States. We have a lot of examples of where elections were corrupt, votes were stolen, people were threatened that they couldn't keep their jobs if they didn't vote in a certain way, etc. And so that's really where we start to see this push for election integrity. I wanted to look a little bit at what this looks like today. So we know, especially since 2016, lots of discussions about election integrity are coming up in the news and just in political discussions. And so I pulled data from a public opinion poll from here in Kansas from 2013. This is from Kansas Speaks. This is run by the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State University. I am a collaborator on this, so I help come up with the questions, essentially, and do some other things, but mostly come up with the questions. And so I pulled the data on this. We have some questions about election integrity in Kansas from October, November 2023. So is this still a concern that Kansans are thinking about? So first, they were asked this question: I am confident that the reported winners of our elections here in Kansas are actually the candidates that most Kansans voted for. There are 477 Kansans that answered this question. That's what that N equals means. The sample that we had was 477 people. About 20%, a little less than 20%, said strongly agree. About 34% said somewhat agree. So we're talking less than 50% of Kansans that think that the reported winners of our elections are actually the candidates who got the most votes. That's concerning for democracy. That's part of why I wanted to pull these in here, because we can talk about democracy theoretically, but we can actually see the data on this as well. The next question is: fraud is generally not a problem in Kansas elections. 17% strongly agreed. 24-ish% somewhat agreed. And so still well below 50% agree that fraud is not a problem in Kansas elections. We have a similar question where voter fraud routinely decides the winners of elections here in Kansas. There are very few people who agree with that. So they may think that voter fraud is happening, but they don't think it's actually deciding elections. Or at least only a very small percentage of them do. State and local election officials in Kansas commit election fraud to alter our election outcomes. Again, very few people actually agree with that. Though still higher than I personally would be comfortable with or am comfortable with. We next see some questions on specific types of election integrity that have come up, some specific examples. So things like undocumented immigrants are voting in Kansas elections in large numbers. Very few people do think that that is happening, though a very large number say they don't know whether that's happening or not. That's what that green is there at the end. And then government has made it too hard to vote here in Kansas. Again, very few people agree or somewhat agree with that. Lots of people somewhat disagree. Lots of people are neutral. And here are, again, some specific examples of different types of election integrity questions that have come up. So vote by mail should be abolished in Kansas. You can see the numbers there. Vote by mail is not a new phenomenon. Vote by mail was actually established during the Civil War. And in Oregon, citizens have exclusively been voting by mail since 2002. So this is not a question that just came up in 2020. This is something that's been happening for a long time, but you can see what Kansans think about it. The next question is about ballot drop boxes. Should they be banned in Kansas? Very few people agree with that, though not quite. A lot of people disagree with that either. Early voting should be abolished in Kansas. Again, very few people agree with that, but still a substantial number there at the bottom. So I pull up those, and I wanted to start with that question, or those questions, because we talk a lot about election integrity, and we should, because election integrity is important to democracy. But the types of questions we have about election integrity, things like voter fraud, are really not major concerns as supported by evidence, at least. So if you look at voter fraud cases in the United States, there are only 0.0003% of all ballots cast would be considered voter fraud. So it's a very small percentage. I'll have more concrete numbers for you here in a minute, because how are you supposed to think about what that actually means? My source here is the Brennan Center for Justice, though I have some other sources coming up that show similar things. We do know that extensive academic research shows that fraud in elections is very rare. So, as evidenced by this giant number here. Most issues that are reported as voter fraud are actually voter or administrative error. And so sometimes you will see, two people with the same name. One of them passes away. The wrong person is removed from the voter rolls, right? So then it looks like someone who has passed away has voted, but they really haven't. There's some sort of mix-up like that. Or you see voters moving from one state to another and don't know that they actually have to cancel their voter registration in the first state to be able to register in the second state. States don't talk to each other. So a lot of the time you actually have to send them an email or a letter saying, remove me from your voter rolls. So those are the types of examples we're talking about here as voter or administrative error. Voter impersonation is virtually non-existent. So people really aren't going to the polls and saying they're someone that they're not to be able to vote. And there's also no evidence of large numbers of people voting illegally either. We have some studies from Arizona State University from 2000 to 2012 that show that there were only 10 cases of voter impersonation fraud nationwide. So of every ballot cast from 2000 to 2012, only 10 of them would be considered voter impersonation. Their studies also show that there are 5 states where politicians were claiming widespread voter fraud, that they were saying did interfere and change election results. There were actually 0 prosecutions for impersonation fraud from 2012 to 2016. And so there's very little evidence that these types of things are actually happening, even though it's a major concern for voters, as we saw in that Kansas Speaks survey. And so I showed some data from the Brennan Center of Justice, from Arizona State University. Those tend to be more liberal-leaning sources. So I also wanted to show some more conservative sources as well. So in 2015, Chris Kobach was given permission by the Kansas legislature to expand his Secretary of State powers to investigate voter fraud. So this is data from his studies of Kansas and then the United States as a whole. So he said, in order for this expansion of powers to happen, that he had 100 cases of illegal votes by non-citizens. There were none found in his actual investigation. There were 4 cases that were brought to court for voter fraud, but only 1 conviction. And all of those were instances where registered citizens double voted. So they voted early and then they went and voted in person. And these were people who were registered, were citizens, they just voted twice. Still not great, right? But not illegal votes being cast by non-citizens either. So he then expanded his research and his studies to look at voter fraud in the United States as a whole. And so he looked at 84 million votes that were cast in 22 states and found 14 instances of voter fraud. So if you do the math on that, that is 0.0000017% voter fraud in all ballots cast. This very tiny, minuscule number, right? Definitely not enough to sway an election. And so while voting irregularities are common, and we see some examples of that, we see administrative error that happens. Kansas itself kind of reports ballots in the way that they have been turned in, and the way that they report them on their website is kind of weird. So it also looks like there are some voting irregularities. That's just an aside. But voter fraud itself is really not common. Yet states and citizens consistently think that these false allegations of fraud are true, and that then undermines free and fair access to the ballot. And so it makes it harder for millions of eligible Americans to actually participate in elections, to actually participate in democracy. And so while election integrity is vital and important to democracy, we also have to find this balance. And so there are questions of electoral fraud, fake news, voter suppression, foreign interference, etc., that have corroded Americans' trust in the electoral process. Trust in government is really low. It's at an all-time low, especially trust in Congress is like the single digits. It's really, really bad. And this is especially true because there's no consensus on the scope of the problem. So how widespread voter fraud actually is, or voter suppression, et cetera. And there's no widespread consensus on the right solutions to these problems. And so what we're seeing is hyperpolarization, where people disagree or they don't know what's actually happening. They hear from their friends, from the media, et cetera, that election integrity is a problem. And so therefore they support things that actually make it harder for people to participate. And so from a democracy perspective, it's really important that we strike the right balance between election security and inclusiveness in voter registration. And so do we want to keep elections free and fair and safe and secure? Absolutely, because that's important to democracy. We don't want foreign interference in elections. We also don't want to go so far in one direction that we're keeping some citizens from participating who should legally be able to. And this really wraps up, or the best way to wrap this up, I think, is to talk about democracy's need for public-minded citizens. So we often teach that democracy comes from institutions. It comes from the executive and the legislative and the Supreme Court, and from elections, or the system of elections, and it comes from the Constitution. And we talk about those things as being democracy, but that's not true. So those are representative of democracy, and they help keep democracy in place, but they're not the only thing that can protect democracy. And we shouldn't look at them as being this institution that will ultimately protect and prevail when democracy is challenged, because that's wrong, especially when we look at a document like the Constitution that is vague and is broad and relies on a lot of norms rather than actual written policies and laws. And so it's better to think about democracy as being not a spectator sport. So democracy is not just something that we can sit back and watch happen. It's something we actively need to participate in. And this is what political scientists tend to call democracy's paradox, is that, or the contradiction with democracy, is that a free people are never truly free because we are required to continually participate in our democracy to make sure that it is healthy and safe and can continue for generations to come. And so it's not just enough to have a constitution and to say we're a democracy if we're not actively living and participating in that. So we can't just sit back and say, oh, great, we have a democracy now, we actively have to do something about it. We have to be active participants and not just spectators in democracy. So thank you for having me today. We do have some time for questions or comments. I also put a QR code up there at the top if you would like to register to vote. You can just pull up your phone, scan the QR code, and it will take you to the Secretary of State website where you can register. Are there any questions or comments? Yeah, you want to come take the microphone?
I'm gonna try this.
Oh, perfect.
Let's see if this one works.
So who determines who's in the Electoral College?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the state legislature gets to choose who goes to the Electoral College to cast ballots. Now, most states do have laws that say that those electors, as we call them, have to cast their ballots in a way that the state's population voted. So they have to legally cast their ballot for, Donald Trump if they're from Kansas in 2020. But it's the state legislature who chooses them. There has also been this question of what we call faithless electors, where can people go to cast their electoral college vote and vote for someone else? Theoretically, there are some states where they can because it's not illegal, but that very rarely happens. And it definitely doesn't make a difference when it does. But yeah, that's a great question. It's our state legislatures who choose them. Other questions or comments?
So is the motivation to perpetuate this myth about voter fraud for voter suppression so that they just make it so difficult for us to vote that then then they can control who that small nidus of voters is?
So I think it's twofold. So I definitely do agree that there are groups of people who that is their goal. Is the only way that they think that they can win an election is by keeping their opponents home. That is true. We know that that happens over and over again. But there are also people who genuinely think that voter fraud and things like that are a problem, that those are things that should be addressed. When we look at the data, that's not supported, right? But that doesn't mean that people don't actually believe that. And so there are people who are genuinely concerned about election integrity, and then there are people who are actively trying to get their opponents to stay home. So it's twofold. That's a great question, though. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you all.
Let's thank
Yes.
Dr. Alex Middlewood, Political Science Department Chair and Professor. We really appreciate you being here today and teaching us. That was a lot of information, but I think it was really valuable. And I would also invite you to check out some of our others in this series. If, voter fraud is something that you like to pay attention to and watch what we're doing here. That's why we're bringing the election office to come talk about how we specifically run elections in Sedgwick County. Voter ID laws, all these things related to our elections. And so we're just going to dive in. We're going to learn all about them, pros, cons, all the discussions that go into it. And so, it's going to be a whole big thing.
Where are these additional presentations advertised?
The question is, where will these be advertised? And they are in our Evolve guide. So the one that the three that I just mentioned, that's insider knowledge because they're not published yet. But we are working on getting that catalog out, and it'll be out next month. And so those will be our March, April, May programs. The Evolve catalog, it's going to be on our website when the Evolve calendar comes out. We also publish it online on our website. And then we'll continue we're putting it out there in all the different channels that we possibly can. But yeah, stay tuned. It's insider knowledge. Still, you can tell your friends. It's cool. Any other questions? Let's give Dr. Alex one more round of applause. That was awesome. All right.